Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining us for a special research presentation. My name is Matt Richmond. I'm an MBA student at MIT Sloan, and it's my pleasure to introduce the presentation, Skill, Luck, and the Battle of the Sexes, an Application of Tennis. Please welcome me, and please join me in welcoming our speaker, Toby Moskowitz.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks, everyone. Always at the end of the conference. I'll try to keep it kind of fun. This is new research with my colleague Niels Rudy, who's sitting over there. I can't see with the lights, but he's right there. He'll answer the most difficult questions. But let me tell you what we're trying to do in this paper. This is preliminary work, so I'll tell you how far we've gotten so far. There's an age-old question about luck versus skill, right? Outcomes are determined by both. And it matters, right? It matters for assessing outcomes, for assessing value, for evaluating players, for creating incentives, and for resource allocation. It matters for sports in particular, which is what we're talking about today, in terms of how you compensate players, whether the value of entertainment, right? If it's all luck or if it's all skill, it's somewhat less entertaining. You want to mix, and just understanding who wins and why. And it matters at all levels, at the player level, at the manager level, at the team level, and at the league level as well. Very difficult question to answer. I'm an economist, and it's something that we spend a great deal of time thinking about in labor markets. Sports provides a nice, unique setting where we think we can measure it pretty well. There's also, when you think about skill and luck, there's multiple dimensions to skill. And so being able to identify those can also be valuable. And as we'll mention, there can be multiple dimensions to luck, which we normally don't think about, but I'll be more specific in a second. Now, we're going to focus on one aspect here. Today, really just focusing on tennis, where you have the structure. It's a little different in the men's and women's game. When you think about Grand Slams, the women play 3 sets, best out of 3, the men best out of 5, and that has an impact on the role of luck versus skill in outcomes. And we're going to try to model that. One way to think about how we're going to approach modeling, and this is something that Niels and I teach in class when we're teaching sports analytics at Yale, is that you really want the model as simple as possible, but not too simple, right? As Einstein put it. So when you think about tennis, the sport of tennis, it has a really strong structure. And because of that, you don't need a great deal of complexity. One way to think about that is structure can substitute for data. In fact, it can provide data if it's generating the data itself. So the structure is part of that data generating process. So we're going to start with a really simple model, a 1-parameter model. An outcome, X, which is a function of skill and luck, we're going to draw from a Bernoulli distribution where we have one parameter called skill that determines, that's going to influence that outcome, right? Skill's going to be a part of the outcome plus some noise or luck. Now, here's what I mean by the structure of tennis is very, very strong, right? We're going to model this as skill just being the probability that you win a single point, okay? So what's your probability of winning a single point? And if you start with that first parameter, you can then model a game, okay? For instance, here's what a game looks like. The probability of winning a single point determines the likelihood that you're up 15-love or 30-love or 15-all. You either move to the right of that decision tree or you move south to the bottom, and the probability is going to dictate how you transition across those different states. Now, we've written out the math here for what that looks like. The probability of winning a game is represented by that smaller function, GP right here. That's normally during a game where you're serving, right? And it's just the sum of the possible states of the world based on your probability of winning a point as you move up or across or down that tree. One thing you can do too, by the way, is how do you deal with deuce, for instance, where you could go back to many, many deuces in tennis. We just solve that recursively, and there's a closed form solution to do that. So we use those methods as well. And then the more complicated expression right there is what a tiebreak looks like, right? Where notice there's 2 probabilities because there's 2 servers during a tiebreak because you alternate. But again, it's just keeping track of everything and adding it all up. But the point is that the probability of winning a point translates through this structure into the probability of winning a game. So once I know that first parameter, I can then simulate or look at the distribution of what the game outcomes are likely to be. Well, we don't have to stop there, because once you have the probability of winning a game, that then determines the probability of winning a set. Because the probability of winning a game, think of that as the transition probability as you go through the tree of a set, which goes from, say, being up 1-love to being up 1-1, or to tied 1-1 or 2-1. You again move to the right or down based on that transition probability of winning a game, which of course is a function of the underlying probability of winning a point. And there's some of the math that goes behind that. You don't have to stop there, right? The probability of winning a set then becomes the transition probability for winning a match, right? As you accumulate the number of sets, whether it's a 3-set or 5-set match, or even if the rules change and they start playing best out of 7. You could do that as well with this structure. And so it gets a little easier now once you have those probabilities. And then if you like, and we're going to do this, you could then do that not just for a single match, but for all matches in a tournament of 128 players and calculate everything up. And then if you like, do that over the career of a single player, which is a function of many tournaments. All of this is being driven by one single data point, right, or one single parameter, which is the probability of winning a point, okay? Now, so what we're going to do is we're going to take that structure and we're going to look at a couple of things, and we have many more on the agenda. But today I'm going to start with 3 versus 5-set matches and contrasting a little bit the WTA, the Women's Tennis League, versus the ATP, the men's. Here's a very simple way to look at what you get from the structure of tennis. Suppose my probability of winning any point in tennis is 0.55, okay? A little bit better than 50-50, but a pretty strong advantage. Given 0.55, my probability of winning a game is about 0.6, okay? In terms of winning a single game. In terms of winning the set, it jumps up to about 0.8, winning a 3-set match about 0.91, and winning a 5-set match about 0.95. In other words, if I have a 0.55 advantage in winning any single point, I'm going to win a 5-set match 95% of the time, right? Skill accumulates, luck is going to cancel out. Now, we can see whether or not, that's the basic concept. Now, I'll get to some data in a second, but here's a little glimpse of the data. Suppose you collected the data on the point shares, okay, of players and how much they win the matches. On the right-hand side here, you see Grand Slams, and I've separated out by men and women in Grand Slams. And you can see here on the x-axis is point win share, the y-axis is match win share. Notice that, so the blue dots are the WTA, the orange or red is the ATP. Notice how much steeper the ATP curve is, right? How much closer it matches point win share with match win share. That's what happens with best out of 5, right? Whereas the women only play best out of 3, their outcomes are more driven by luck than skill because they play fewer points. If you look on the left here, you can do an apples-to-apples comparison. If you look at the tournaments where men also only play 3-set matches, so these are the non-Grand Slams, you can see the curves are, the best fit lines, for instance, are very, very similar. Actually, the men's look slightly steeper, but that's because we haven't taken into account yet the fact that serving, which I'll come to in a second, it's a little more important in the men's game, and that's probably going to explain most of that difference. Okay. Now, the model I'm going to show you that we're going to develop, this is not coming from data at all. If I just use the model to tell us what would you expect the point win share, how would that match up with the match win share, those are those curves there in orange and blue that you see superimposed on the graph. Notice they match it pretty well. So those curves, just to be clear, they're not designed to fit the data. They're simply simulated from the model based on the structure of tennis, and it matches it pretty well, okay, without even trying to. We're going to merge this with the data in just a minute. Okay, so I think it's useful to kind of go through a little bit of the model of how we do this and then try to look at some inferences we can make in the data. So the basic idea is skill accumulates, luck cancels out, right? It's a pretty simple idea. So the probability of winning a 5-set match is greater than a 3-set match, which is greater than winning a set or a game or a point. So the way we're going to model this is obviously it's not just your skill that matters, it's who you're playing against. So one way to think about it is we have a skill parameter called gamma for player I, and theta, which is the difference between your skill and the player matched up against, gamma j, is going to represent that skill difference. And that's going to be converted under some distributional assumptions into a probability of you winning the point, okay, which is represented there as Pij. All right? Now, what we're going to do is actually pretty well known. If you remember Roger Federer's tennis speech at Dartmouth, he said he's been in 1,526 singles matches in his career, won almost 80% of them, but he only won 54% of the points. And the way he talks about it, that's how, you have to not think about losing a point, right? If you thought about it, then you just have to get ready just for the next shot. That's the way to win. That's pretty consistent with what we're going to show you because of the structure of tennis. Okay? However, if you look at Federer's career, not all matches are created equal. What he's reporting, which is true, is on average. But this is a plot here on the x-axis of the probability of Roger Federer winning a point at different rounds in the tournaments he played in. This is just in Grand Slams, by the way. And on the y-axis is his probability of winning those matches. Okay, there's the frequency with which he won those matches. So notice early in the first round and second round, he has like a high 50% probability of winning any given point, which translates in those early rounds into a 90 to high 90% of winning those matches. Okay. As the tournament progresses, notice his probability of winning a point goes down. Why? Well, he's playing better players, right? And his probability of winning the match also goes down a fair bit, right? So it's true on average, but it's different depending on, obviously, who he's playing. Now contrast that with Serena Williams. In Serena Williams, if you do the same plot, notice, first look at the bottom. Serena Williams had a higher probability of winning a point than Federer at almost every round of the tournament. Okay? That's how dominant she was in her prime in tennis. But if you look at the curve in terms of her probability of winning the Grand Slam, or winning the match at each round in the Grand Slam, notice early on in the tournament, it's lower than Federer's, but as you get to the semifinals and finals, it's greater. Now, what's driving that? Well, the first part's pretty easy to understand given the structure of tennis. Actually, both are because of the structure of tennis. But the first part is the first order effect. When Serena's only playing best out of 3, more luck is involved. She's more likely to lose, therefore her skill's not going to matter as much because of the luck component, relative to Federer, who got to play 5 best out of 5, in which case that skill's going to dominate more. So you can see that here on the left if you look at the first sort of 4 rounds of the tournament. So what explains the flip of that as you get to the semifinals and finals? Well, it's the second order effect of this luck effect, which is Federer is going to end up playing better players in the semifinals and finals because they also enjoy the fact that they play 5-set matches and therefore are less likely to lose early on. Whereas Serena is more likely to face weaker opponents later on in the tournament because some of the strongest opponents may have lost earlier because it's only best out of 3. Now, our model can take all of that into account because it's going to simulate all those possibilities based on the role of skill and luck. And in this way, you can think of 2 different types of luck. There's the luck that you win a point, even if you're the better player, or lose a point, even if you're a better player, or the luck that you lose a match that you should win. But then there's also the luck of who you end up facing in the draw. So there's the luck from the playing itself, as well as the luck of who you're playing against, all driven by this simple structure. Okay, and then in case you thought Federer was special, Federer's curve looks exactly like Djokovic's, right? And it's really a function of the structure of tennis more so than the player. Okay, so what does our model actually look like? And I'll go through a little bit of details and then do some more inference. We're actually going to look at not just skill of the player, and we'll try to measure that in a second, but also we're going to add a serving piece. Your skill is more valuable when you're serving, and it's less valuable when you're receiving. The way we're going to model that is we're going to increase your skill by delta when you're serving, and it's going to be decreased by that when you're receiving, but it's the difference in deltas between who you're playing against. So every player gets an average skill parameter and a serve parameter as well, and that serve parameter is really the difference between how much they win when they're serving versus how much they win when they're receiving. So it's kind of the difference between those 2 things. And that's going to translate into 2 probabilities, the probability of winning a point when you serve and the probability of winning a point when you receive. So now it's a two-parameter model in that sense. We can also, and we're in the process of doing this, we could add other things to this. Because of the structure of tennis, you can measure things very precisely. We could add surface parameters. We haven't done that yet, but it's being worked on. Or tournament-specific effects. Lots of different things we could add to this. Okay? All right, so I'm going to go through this not in too much detail, but I think it's instructive to think about how the model works. It's a hierarchical model, and we're going to generate these distributions. So you start at the top with just some prior. Okay, think of it as a Bayesian framework. That's what it is. You have a prior on what the distribution of skill is, what the mean and variance or distribution of the serving parameter is that increases your skill when you're serving and decreases it a little bit when you're returning. And then if you want, you could add a surface parameter as well. We start with that prior, and that implies a distribution for skill that we draw from called gamma, a distribution for serves as well as for surfaces. And then you take those parameters and you plug them into a logistic function, just a 0-1 function that says, or it gives you a probability that says, what's the probability of you winning the point based on those things? So if you look at that equation there in the parentheses that says logistic, it's a function of your skill, what surface you're playing on, whether you're serving or not, relative to who you're playing, and they have those same pieces as well, okay? And we're going to create a different function for when you're serving versus when you're receiving. That then spits out a probability that you're going to win the point, PIM and PJM for when you're serving or receiving, and then that gets mapped into a model where you're going to predict the outcome based on that, right? And that outcome could be in terms of games, or aggregated up to sets, or matches, or eventually tournaments, okay? That's where we start. That's the model. Now, eventually, right, that's going to spit out a distribution of, we can actually match this to point data, actual outcomes on the ATP and WTA tour, and then using those outcomes, we can feed it back through this framework to go back to the priors and inform those priors to form what we call a posterior, right, which is a distribution that's updated not based on your initial beliefs, but on what the actual data looks like, okay? And that's the process. One cool thing about this that we haven't played around with yet, or not in this presentation, is I'm gonna apply this to data in a second. We have point-by-point data going back to the 1990s on the men's tour and the early 2000s on the women's tour. But if you want to go back further than that, there's no point-by-point data. So what do? Well, you do have game data, right? You have outcomes of the matches. That goes back to the 1960s. And what's cool about this is if you don't have point data, you could actually interrupt this process by looking at the distribution of games. Games, of course, are a function of the points. You just don't get to see them as a statistician. But you can infer, obviously with more noise, what the skill level is just from the games using this framework. So what's kind of nice about this is you can fill in data that doesn't exist by using the structure of tennis and applying it to data that does exist in different years. And that's something that we're currently working on. And we want to see how precise that is. It's obviously going to be a bit more noisy, but the question is, can we still do reliable inferences using that? Okay, so what's our first step? Before we even touch the data, let's make sure the model works. Let's start with a set of priors that we just pull out of the air, feed it through this whole model, and it's going to generate a simulation of tournament results, match results, distribution of points results. And then if we take that simulated data and feed it back through the model, do we actually recover the parameters we started with? That would tell you it's internally consistent and it works. So we've done all that. The inference parameters do match the actual parameters that come out of the simulation. And you do that so that you're not tweaking the model to try to fit the data. Now, once we've done that, now let's apply it to some data. And the data we're going to use, and I want to give a shout out to Jeff Sackman here. He's got this great data. It's a great public good called Tennis Abstract, which has point-by-point data and many other things, by the way, on all kinds of tournaments, including challenger events that we're not even using and many other things. So a really great resource. And what we're going to do is we're going to take that data and a set of players that are in that tournament and estimate a distribution of skill across all those players, okay? As well as skill, not just overall skill, but also their serving skill, Those are the only two parameters we're going to use. As I said, we're working on surfaces, and we can add other things. The way we're going to do this is we're going to use 1 year of data. So if the tournament's today, we're going to look back a full year, going all the way back to the previous year's tournament, and look at all the matches and point data and use that to estimate the initial parameters. So for example, I'm going to show you results for the 2024 US Open for men. We're going to look back a year, which is 2,888 matches across 667 players over the past year. And by the way, you might say, well, there's not 667 players in the US Open, right? That's true. However, you still get information from the players that are in the US Open had to play. You're learning from all that data. So we're going to use all of it going back a full year. Now, there's a lot of variation here. Most players don't play a lot of matches because they lose early, right? Some players, like Djokovic and Sinner, play a lot of matches, right? Not just a lot of tournaments, but they go deep in those tournaments. So the precision of the data by player certainly varies. Okay, but here's an example of how we're doing this. So suppose you were just going to estimate, you want to simulate the tournament for the Australian Open and make predictions. You're going to use the data from all the tournaments 1 year prior. And here they are, going all the way back to the previous year's Australian Open in 2023. Same with Wimbledon, and what we're going to do in this exercise is for the US Open. So there's the data estimation window that we're using. Includes last year's US Open, the previous year's, plus all the tournaments in between, including the Grand Slams, but not just the Grand Slams. All right? Now, we can do this for the men and the women. The points data, which you see over here to the right, you can see it goes all the way back to the 90s. For the men, it starts in 2004 for the women's game. So less data available for the women's game. As I said, we're working on what do we do when we don't have points data. Can we fill it in with other outcomes like game outcomes to estimate this? Okay, so future work will incorporate that. All right, so when we apply this to the data, let's just see if it makes any sense. We know the model works in the sense that it can recover the inputs we give it. That's great, but let's just see if it actually makes, does it pass the smell test here? So on the x-axis here is what we're estimating as the mean player skill. Remember, this is 1 year of data at the beginning of 2024 before the US Open, okay? On the y-axis is the mean player serve effect, okay, which we're trying to capture. And one good thing that comes out of this is you can see the top 5 seeds all show up to the far right. Okay, so that's not that surprising, but it would be a problem for our model if we didn't get that. So you see Sinner, Djokovic, Alcaraz, Medvedev, Zverev, all there. But in addition, is the model actually picking up who has the bigger server effects? Well, yeah, if you look at the very top of the graph here, you've got Ben Shelton, you've got Hurkacz, you've got I always mispronounce his name, Petri Paragard, right, who's a ridiculous server. So it's picking up the players that we think that sounds about right. They have this big serve advantage. We can do the same thing for the women, and it works pretty well as well. And just to be clear, the serve advantage, remember, is how good you are on serving relative to how good you are on receiving, right? So it's the gap between those. If you're great at both, you're not going to show up very high on this in terms of the serve effect. But you can see here, the model loves Iga Swiatek and Sabalenka, and then you can see it's sort of ranking some of the same, the players that you think ought to be on this chart in the right positions. Okay, now, keeping in mind, there's uncertainty in these estimates. The nice thing about this framework and using this Bayesian framework is you also get a distribution for what the skill level looks like. So you can see here on the left, these are the players that have estimated highest player ability over the last year prior to 2024 based on the point outcomes in the matches they played. You see Sinner, Djokovic, Alcaraz at the top. It's got the top 4 seeds right in a row. It's got Alex de Minaur, number 5, even though he's seeded 10th. But roughly the seeding and the skill level are pretty highly correlated. There's a few in here too, right? You've got Berrettini in the middle, but he's got a wide confidence interval. You've got John Isner near the bottom there with a pretty decently high skill level, but massive amount of variance around that. And same on the women's side, as you can see Swiatek off to the right, but then Sabalenka, Goff, Rybakina, It makes sense. Muchova, wide standard deviation. Osaka, wide standard deviation, right? High mean, but high variance as well, okay? Now, that's just in terms of skill level. What about the probability of winning the tournament? Okay, remember, the skill level is the parameter we feed into the model. That then determines the probability of winning a point, a game, a set, a match, and then eventually the tournament. If we aggregate that all up, this is what our predictions would be for the 2024 US Open for winning the tournament. And the numbers in the boxes are what the betting markets were saying at the beginning of the tournament as to who would win the tournament. And what you can see here is the model does a pretty decent job. Djokovic and Sinner are near the top, although betting markets liked Alcaraz better than both. Okay? Our model didn't say that. On the other hand, our model liked Swiatek much more than Sabalenka. Betting markets like Sabalenka a bit better. But if you plot this, you can see that, to a first-order approximation, the model predicts the outcome of the tournament pretty consistently with what betting odds were showing. There, you get sort of a stack of players here kind of vertically at the bottom because they have small probabilities of winning the tournament. When you look at sort of Tommy Paul, Berrettini, Ruud, you're talking about less than 1% chance of winning the tournament, and our model might say it's 0.5%, right? So that seems like a big difference, relative difference, but we're talking about small numbers. That's always challenging. And on the women's side, you can see a similar fit, maybe even slightly better in terms of betting odds and the probability of winning the US Open. Okay, what else can you do with this? Well, suppose we take this model. Remember, I'm estimating it year by year based on each tournament, right? Well, you can also look at this over time by doing that same methodology and kind of a rolling measure of skill. So here are 5 players, not chosen at random, 5 players historically over our sample, who we picked 5 players that had the highest level of skill at any point in their career, which is something like a 0.4 measure of skill. So you see Andy Murray right here, right? Pretty consistent with his career, right? The skill we're inferring from the points he won kind of peaks, right, in the sweet spot of his career, and then came down as he aged and was injured and got older. You can see how consistent and how durable Djokovic is, right, looking at the skill. And then you can see Nadal and Federer as well with that kind of hump-shaped pattern, which is pretty consistent with what we see in most sports. One of the interesting ones that popped up was Robin Soderling, who had a couple of peaks where he hit very, very high skill level. When he beat Nadal at the French Open, the first loss Nadal ever had at the French Open, that was a big deal, right? The model really, really liked that. And he ended up retiring pretty early because of injuries. But in terms of skill level, according to the model, he was pretty high up there for a time. We can do the same thing in the women's game. And you see, in terms of the highest skill levels at certain points in their career, Mauresmo, Henin, Davenport, Sharapova, of course, the Williams sisters, and you can see their trajectory there, as well as Azarenka. And so this is another thing you can do with this model is look at it over time, okay? Okay, I already mentioned different forms of skill and luck. Let me talk a little bit more about what else is interesting. Let's come back to this discrepancy between the men's and women's game in Grand Slams. The men play 5 sets, best out of 5. The women play best out of 3. One interesting question we can ask with this model is, when does a player's skill level, okay, or winning probability change in a significant way if you were to switch from 5 to 3 sets? Remember, through the structure of the model, we can change these things any way we want. And I found this really interesting, which is if you look in the men's game, the top 3 seeds really benefit from a 5-set match in terms of winning the tournament. But if you're seeded less than those, Zverev is kind of at the inflection point, but if you're outside of the top 3 seeds, you actually would prefer a best out of 3 tournament. You've got a better chance of winning a Grand Slam if it's best out of 3 than best out of 5, because the top 3 seeds are enough better than you that in 5 sets, your chances go way down, okay? So I think that's kind of interesting, how concentrated the differences in talent are just among the very, very top 3 players, particularly the top 2. And similarly in the women's game, Swiatek wants best out of 5, maybe Sabalenka too, but everybody else would prefer best out of 3 if they want to increase their probability of winning a Grand Slam. And so it's really interesting how fast that advantage drops off if you were to switch the structure of the game. Okay? And we can do this, player by player across different rounds of the tournament. So on the x-axis here is going from round 1 all the way to the finals, and it's done for each of these players. The red being best out of 3 sets, the blue being best out of 5, and you can see for Sinner and Djokovic, it's pretty clear they benefit from best out of 5. Alcaraz does too, maybe until you get to the semis or finals. Everybody else, they would definitely prefer, they would prefer best out of 5 early in the tournament, and once they hit sort of the quarters and have to play one of these other players, the top 3 in particular, they would prefer best out of 3, right? It changes the mix of skill versus luck and what's going to matter for outcomes. And same with the women. Pretty clearly, Swiatek, there's no difference early in the round. She's got nearly 100% winning round 1 or 2. But later on in the tournament, once you get to the quarters or semis, outside of the top 2 or 3 seeds, you would prefer that best out of 3 rather than a best out of 5 if they were to change the women's game. Okay. So one of the things that you can do, and what I was doing just then with those curves was plotting what we call counterfactuals. This is something economists deal with all the time. What would the world look like if something that isn't true happened to be true? In other words, what would the world look like if women actually did play best out of 5 sets? And you got a glimpse of that from those charts. You can do the same thing on the men's side. What would the world have looked like if the men had played best out of 3 instead of best out of 5? So this little table, this was something that a grad student worked on with Niels and I back at Yale, which is without even simulating the model, you can do a counterfactual for men doing something very simple, which is you could actually just look at Djokovic's 24 Grand Slam wins and say, how many times in those tournaments was he down 2 sets? Because he wouldn't have won the tournament at that point if that had happened. Well, it turns out of his 24 Grand Slam wins, 6 of them he would have lost because he was down by 2 sets at some point in the tournament. So that's 18 if he had been playing best out of 3. You could do the same for Nadal, and of his 22 Grand Slams, 2 he wouldn't have won because he was down by 2 sets. And for Federer, you could do the same thing. Out of his 20, there were 2 that he wouldn't have won because he was down by 2 sets. Although for Federer, he also gains 2 matches because there were 2 finals where he was down 2 sets and eventually won. Okay? So, the opposite of that. So there are wins added here as well. And we just look at the finals there. So if you did an adjusted wins of Grand Slams for best out of 3, an approximation just from the data, Djokovic would have won 18, Nadal 20, and Federer 20. Okay? What about for Serena? Well, we don't actually have data on 5-set matches because they don't exist, but we can simulate it with the model. Okay? And so that's what we're going to do. We're going to take a look at simulating this. What would the world have looked like if the men had actually played best out of 3 and the women had played best out of 5, and do a comparison? Okay? So this distribution here shows you for Djokovic, Nadal, and Federer, the big 3. Okay? On the left is what our model says based on their skill, which is coming from the data, right? Their probability of winning a point, what the distribution of Grand Slam wins would have been in their career if they played best out of 3. Nadal is in the green, shifted to the left. Djokovic and Federer are in red and blue, and you can see they're right on top of each other. The dashed lines represent the actual number of Grand Slams they won in the data period that we have. So just to be clear, it only starts in, the point-by-point data only starts, we're using here in around 2004. So for Federer, we do lose 1 Grand Slam here. But you can see here that Nadal would have, best out of 3, the estimate would have been about 15 Grand Slams. For Djokovic and Federer, it's more like closer to 19 or 20. But best out of 5, you can see it's spot on pretty close to what they actually got, which is around 20 for Federer, and it's about 22 for Nadal, and again, pretty close to 22, 23 for Djokovic. Okay? So the model sort of recovers that pretty nicely. Now, I will say one thing here. Remember I told you we're not modeling surfaces. Nadal's getting penalized a little bit here, right? Because the model is underappreciating the 14 French Opens he won and never lost a match for many stretches of that. So we feel like that his distribution is going to shift a little bit to the right once we take that into account. But that's not in this current model. Okay, and then we can look at this player by player, right? This is a little bit easier way to see it. This is the distribution for Djokovic, Nadal, and Federer if they had played best out of 3 versus best out of 5. And you can see how the role of skill and luck is affecting the outcomes here, okay? All right, what about Serena, okay? How many matches would Serena have benefited from or won within the limited sample if she had played best out of 5 instead of best out of 3? Okay, now, first of all, given the data limitations that it only starts in 2004, there are 6 slams that we don't have for Serena. Okay, so although she won 23, we're already starting off with 17 as being her actual number of slams that she won. Okay, so just that's why the dashed line there is at 17 and not at 23. And then notice if you look at the red distribution there, our model says that is about what you would have expected. And if you look at the modal data point there, it's pretty spot on to 17 Grand Slams that Serena would have won in best out of 3 matches, okay, which is exactly what happened over that sample period. Had they been best out of 5, that distribution would have shifted to the right, okay, and she would have won approximately 3 more Grand Slams. So going from 17 to 20, or if you credit her with the other 6 that we don't have in the data, that would go from 23 to 26 Grand Slams, right? Just based off of skill. So just to bring this all back together for a second, all we're doing here is measuring a very simple parameter. What is your skill level, right? Your probability of winning a point, and we're measuring it whether you're serving or receiving. That's the only nuance in this model. Just that simple model can generate the implications of what would happen if you switched from 3 to 5 sets and what the world would have looked like if Serena was able to play best out of 5, right? She would be the Grand Slam champion, at least based on the skill level at the time. And just to keep in mind, this isn't just about luck versus skill in winning a game or point in a particular match, but also who you face in the tournament. So the model takes that all into account. It's taking into account the reason Serena would win 3 more Grand Slams and not necessarily 6 more is because it also recognizes she would be facing tougher opponents if it was best out of 5 as well. So that's all in here. In other words, there's multiple dimensions to luck that we're trying to take into account. Okay, so before I open it up to questions, a couple of concluding thoughts and some more directions that we could take this model to, all right? First of all, what does structure buy you? Well, structure it fills in when you have a lack of data. It provides data. Why? Because structure is what's it's the underlying data generating process. It's generating that data. What that does for you, especially when you have data, is it allows you to have very precise inference, okay? Given that, you can now identify things that have been very elusive. Certainly in my field, in economics and finance, it's very hard to identify luck from skill. If I see a hedge fund perform well over the last year, we want to attribute it to skill, but a lot of it's probably luck. How do you differentiate those two? It's very hard when there's a lack of structure. In sports, we have an ability to do that, especially a sport like tennis, where there's a strong structure. Once you have that, then you can do all kinds of interesting things like these counterfactuals. What would the world look like if we changed some of the rules, okay? It also, in our case, what we're focused on today is it makes a clear difference between the structure of the men's and women's game. The fact of the matter is Grand Slams for the women's game, because they're best out of 3 versus best out of 5, their outcomes are more prone to luck, okay? So it's hard to make comparisons across those two. When people say who's the greatest tennis player of all time, it's hard to do it across gender when the rules aren't the same and when the role of skill and luck isn't the same, okay? Now, what else can you do? All right, well, here's a lot of future work we could do and some things that we're trying to do. First of all, there's a lot of interesting implications, let's say, for in-play betting odds, right? We're looking at match outcomes and game outcomes and things of that nature, but what do in-play betting odds say about that? We've only matched it so far to, betting odds in terms of who wins the tournament. We've talked about career trajectory, and we've done a little bit of that already. One other thing that we can do is, remember I mentioned earlier, that not all players have the same amount of data, right? The top players play a lot of matches and a lot of points. They have the most data. What do you do with new players that come on the scene or players that have only been playing for a short period of time? They're going to have really imprecise estimates of their skill. And one thing you can do is use the structure of the model to compare similar types of players, both at the same point in time or even through time. Players that match on skill level or on serve skill measure and kind of infer what their distribution might look like. Given that you're talking about measuring skill versus luck, you can also look at multiple dimensions of skill, right? You could say, hey, maybe certain players play better at pressure points. Well, that's another parameter you could put in the model and try to estimate it, see if it's there, do hypothesis testing. Or injury identification. When there's a structural break where skill drops off all of a sudden, either during a match or across matches, is that a way to identify who might be injured or not? And then there's game design. If the leagues are, when they decided to go from a 7-point to a 10-point tiebreaker, how did that change how skill and luck might affect the outcomes? When you think about the doubles rules, no ad scoring, how does that change the role of skill and luck? And you can look at this across many dimensions even before you have any data to do so. The model gives you that. And then you can do kind of fun things like who was the luckiest or unluckiest players in history, those kinds of things. And I mentioned filling in with game data. So I'll wrap up with a plug for other sports where you could do a similar type of thing, though it's much harder. Take the sport of football, it's soccer, because we're here, but Niels, my co-author, is from Norway, so call it football. But we present this to our students. Notice the difference in structure between, say, tennis, which is highly structured, and soccer, where it's much more fluid, right? It's a more open game. The orange curve here is the probability of winning the match based on your probability of success on a given point. So again, 0.55 translates into about a 95% success rate in a 5-set match. But for soccer, if you have a 0.55 advantage in scoring a goal, you're going to win the soccer match about 57% of the time, right? The role of luck is much more prevalent in soccer than it is in tennis. It just doesn't have that strong factor structure. So you can do this across lots of different sports. Basketball would be somewhere in between those two curves, would be my prediction. So I'm going to stop there and see if there's any questions. I think we have about 7 minutes for questions, and thanks for your time. I think Matt's going to pass around the microphone.
Excellent work, first off. Really fascinating. I was also a tennis pro before a stats person, so particularly relevant to me. Just really excellent work.
Well,
Did have some thoughts, though, for updating the model. For example, stamina and fitness tends to go down as you get older. So playing well best of 5 in your 30s is harder than in your 20s. Like Serena won 10 slams after 30, but Federer only 4. So in an odd way, sometimes that day off, she's got a day off in a slam to rest up and only best of 3, while a regular tournament plays best of 3 every day was more taxing for her. And so there's a complexity there that maybe could be added to the model. It's almost like at your end of your career, I think Federer at 35 would have liked best of 3 slams because he would have had a better chance because they were shorter and he didn't have the physical. Just an idea.
Yeah, no, maybe. And you're right. One thing, the way we model it, of course, is we treat every point as independent, right? But you're right. Points may not be independent. Matches may not be independent. And then there's the whole, independence of the career, too, as you get older. But it's something, again, that would add more complexity to it. But you're right. It may pick up something in the data. What's nice is with the structure, we can test hypotheses like that, right, and see if they matter. But yeah, great point. Yes?
Thank you again for your presentation. One of the questions I had was specifically about the model when you were basing the skill factor and you were looking at the previous year of data. For the matches, did you weigh Grand Slam and non-Grand Slam matches the same? And especially on the men's side, because those are obviously different if you're trying to predict a slam that is 5 sets. Are you using the 3-set tour level matches as the same weight as the 5-set Grand Slam matches?
We are currently, but remember, what we're trying to measure is your probability of winning a point. So it matters who you're playing against. But you're right, we could think about different ways of weighting the data, something we have to think about. And I don't know if Niels, if there's anything more to add on that in terms of other things we could think about doing.
They're partially weighted more because it's more sets.
Yeah.
And the best players play more Grand Slam, so they're more represented there. But we're also looking at more a dynamic model over time, but we're still simulating that, so we haven't, it's not out of the laboratory yet. So it's not ready for the real data, but hopefully in a month or so.
Yeah, so lots of things we have. Thanks.
I just had a question about, because we're treating all the points as independent, is it fair to say that, let's say I'm in a tennis match and I'm down 0-40 in a set, am I equally likely to still win the next point even though my opponent's 1 point away from just clearing the set?
So that's the way we're modeling it. That doesn't mean that it's necessarily true in the data. But again, one thing you can do is test that hypothesis, right? The nice thing about structure is you can say, hey, look, does conditioning on the score matter, right? Now keep in mind, this is what we mean by simple models. If I don't have to make that assumption, I have so much more data, I can estimate the parameters so much more precisely. If now the score matters, the state space of things I have to estimate blows up. Might be worth having that complexity if it really does matter, but that's something that you can test, right? So we always like to start with the simplest, see how far we can get, and then, yeah, tweak it. I mean, right now we're thinking dynamics might be important. We think surface is important, so we're certainly adding that. But the next phase might be maybe that independence assumption in some way isn't correct, but yeah.
Hey, Toby, good
Hey, Chris.
job. I just had a couple questions about the link between your model implied odds and the Vegas odds that you showed. So there was one chart specifically that was interesting to me on the, I think it was the women's odds. It looked like most of the points were below the line, which to me implies a betting strategy where you'd be shorting all the individual players and buying the field. Like that one right there.
Yeah. I think that you're right. That's a good observation. In fact, you're right, because Swiatek had such, Sabalenka actually has the highest betting odds, but the top two seeds really there. But keep in mind, these are really small probabilities, right?
No, for sure. Yeah, it's hard to monetize that. But
if we had good, you're right, in terms of betting markets, there's big differences, right, between a 1% chance of winning the tournament and a 2% chance, right? But you're talking about very, very, very low odds. But this is something that we haven't even tried to match it to betting odds yet.
Yeah, that was my sort of more general question is how much have you looked at the links and tried to, I mean, it feels like you could take this structure and try to figure out where your model is implying something quite different than the Vegas odds, right?
Yeah, that's right. And then it'll be a question of, I'm always worried about whether, markets got something wrong or we did. It's most likely us, right? So one way to start would be to take the odds to infer through actually what you can do, you could start with the odds and say that that's the truth and back out from our structure what the implied skill parameter must be, and then kind of simulate and see if how well that works out of sample. But these are all things that we plan to do, we just haven't done yet.
Thanks.
Yeah, go ahead, Niels. Yeah.
I think a good way to think about that distance is the margin of the bookmaker, and that margin is bigger for the lower probability winners.
Yeah, we could adjust for that. We could adjust for the margin, and it might look a little different. But yeah. Anyway, that's certainly on the to-do list, is to use the betting odds a little bit more judiciously.
If you guys are calculating luck, especially as you go through a career, are you guys redoing the draws, or are you taking the draw that was done and then going out from there?
So in the you're redoing the draws in the sense that it matters who you play against, right? So if the women play best out of 5, this will take into account that Serena's more likely to face one of the top seeds in the semifinals and finals, more so than she actually did in best out of 3, right? So that will be taken into account.
Right, yeah. I'm asking if the draws themselves are random, like who you play in the first few rounds and where you are relative to the...
We haven't done this yet. This is a really good question. We haven't done this yet, but the rankings themselves, right, are based on the outcomes of these tournaments, which then forms the seeding. So what we can do, but we haven't done yet, is to actually map them to rankings and then map them to the seedings in the tournaments and even redraw the seedings. And that would be another piece of luck. So yeah, you're right, absolutely right. It's a great point, which is you've got the luck of winning or losing the match, you've got the luck of who you play against in that draw, and then you've got the luck of whether the draw could have looked different based on the fact that the previous if you change the structure of the game. The previous seedings or the previous rankings which determine the seed could have looked different. The other thing we can do as an economist is what I'm interested in. Rankings also translate into dollars, and winning also, you can map this to dollars to see, how resources were allocated. So you can do all that as well. Yeah, good point.
Hi there. Very interesting. So thank you very much for doing this. A question to ask you. It seems in the women's game recently, there's a bigger variation of the top 10 players. Obviously, number 1, number 2, Iga and Sabalenka have been there kind of steady for a while. But in general, there's a lot of motion in the women's game, even in the top 20, let's just say, versus the men's game. And even if you're looking at the men's graph that you had before versus the women's graph, which seemed quite similar in terms of their trajectory, is that a question of luck? Is that a question of women are, I don't want to say less skill, but let's say the skill between the top 20 players is closer? Is there that variation in skill? So just interesting to get your...
I actually don't know the answer, so I'm not even sure if the premise is right, but it's testable, right? So one thing we could do is we could look at the distribution of skill among the top 20 women versus the top 20 men and see if that's in fact correct. I don't know that that's the case, and I don't know if it's changed over time as well, which would also be interesting. If it is different, right, it would be interesting to think about why. Is that because of the dearth of players that go into the women's game versus the men? Is it something else? I don't think it's because of I don't think it's the structure, the 3 versus 5. That would be true for Grand Slams, but not for the other tournaments. Well, you see that, yeah, I alluded to that here. If we go back to this for a second, you can see that, sorry, the line is a little steeper on the left for the men versus the women, but I think that is the serve effect, right? But there may be other things besides that as well. I do think that's true.
And that might be why the big 3 were so dominant.
Could be.
Versus the women, maybe Serena dominated, but number 2, 3, 4 weren't necessarily at her level, so maybe there was that variation.
Yeah, it could be. Could be. And actually, speaking of the Williams sisters, I mean, another counterfactual that we were planning to run is how many slams would Venus had won if Serena hadn't been there, right? There's all kinds of interesting things you can do once you have this structure.
Thank you. Appreciate it. I actually grew up playing tennis and played in college as well. And I was always taught that tennis is 90% mental. So how do you take into account momentum, confidence, even players that start tanking into the model?
I would call that skill, right? So we're not taking a stance on what determines skill. Skill is, it could be mental, it could be stamina, it could be just your skill in hitting the ball, of course. That's normally what we think of skill. Skill has multiple dimensions to it. The way we're defining it is just your probability of winning a point based on all of those attributes, right? Now, what I think is interesting is if you can measure, suppose we end up with this, we call it a gamma, right, which is your skill parameter. That parameter itself is a function of many possible attributes, including your mental state, right? So to the extent you could measure those pieces, you could actually decompose that skill and see where it comes from. We're not even doing that. We're just saying, are you better for whatever reason, right? Taller, faster, stronger, more mentally fit, more stamina, it doesn't matter. It shows up in skill, but it's not luck. It's not coming from randomness. That's what we're primarily interested in. But that's exactly right. You could look at lots of dimensions of that skill parameter. We have serve. That's one nuance to skill, right? That's the only thing we're adding to it so far. Yeah. Start simple. You can definitely get complicated.
There was a slide where you did the hypothetical of the top men's US Open seeds probabilities if it were 3 sets out of 5 instead of 5.
I'll find it.
If I remember correctly, the change in their probability to win the tournament went down by more for Sinner than it did for Djokovic. They were the top 2 seeds. I don't know if, I think it maybe is further than this.
You want this one?
No, much further.
Or this one.
Oh, yeah, back? Yeah, there we go.
Yeah.
So the Djokovic and Sinner have pretty similar probabilities of winning the tournament with 5 sets, and they both go down when you go to 3, but the delta is bigger for Sinner. Do you think that's just because Sinner has a larger serve effect than Djokovic does, or is it something else?
It's a good question. I had noticed that. I'm not sure, but we could dig into the model to see what it is. I don't know, Niels, if you know, we could.
I don't know, did you include serving?
This is includes
I don't know,
serve
but
here, yes.
You did?
part of it may be the
Interesting.
bracket, that it also changed
Yeah.
the likelihood throughout
And
your journey. So
Djokovic-
I don't know.
Djokovic is aged, I don't know, but you didn't take that into account. He'd like 3 setters now.
Well,
Like he
it's
won the
taken into
Olympics,
account in the
right?
sense that we measured his skill over the prior year.
Okay,
Yeah,
so
so
I mean,
that's
as
in
he's
there, yeah.
aged, there's got to be some decline. I know he's a Superman, but.
Well, it's whatever he performed in 2023, that's what determines his skill. Yeah. So,
Just curious if you thought about applying this to maybe other point-type games, such as volleyball, right, where they
exactly, I
follow a
was just
point game set. So is the general finding here of skill and luck the same for any of those sports as well?
yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. In fact, there's a good chance Niels and I will assign something like that to our students next year. But yeah, volleyball, table tennis, lots of sports could follow a similar kind of structure, and you could map. We had some students a few years ago that did volleyball, didn't we, Niels? That did not exactly like this, but some attempt at doing this. But sure, this is, we're doing tennis because we just started there, but you could apply this to lots of sports that have that strong structure. All right, I think that's it. Thank you, everybody. So.